What did Iran look like 2,500 years ago? Not a wasteland of war, as many people imagine, but the beating heart of one of the most sophisticated empires of the ancient world. In what is now southern Iran, a ceremonial city called Parsa, later known to the Greeks as Persepolis, rose above the plain on a massive stone platform begun by Darius I around 518 BC. This was not just a place of palaces, towering columns, and royal treasure. It was a stage where delegations from across the empire arrived each spring, bringing their gifts, languages, and identities to stand before the King of Kings. And yet this same city, built to display the unity of Persia, would one day be consumed by fire in a single night. There are cities built to govern, cities built to trade, cities built to defend a frontier, choke a mountain pass, or control a river. And then, very rarely, there are cities built to teach an empire how to see itself. Parsa was one of those cities. Most people know it by the Greek name Persepolis, the city of the Persians, a name history handed down from the language of outsiders. But the Persians who built it did not think of it as a monument for foreigners to admire centuries later. They built it as a stage where the empire could gather, where distance could be turned into ceremony, where tribute could be transformed into something more delicate and more dangerous than fear. Recognition. That is what makes the story of its destruction so much heavier than a simple tale of conquest. Because when Alexander entered Parsa in 330 BC, he did not walk into just another royal capital. He walked into the one place in the Persian world that could have taught him how to become more than a conqueror. And instead, in one of history's most famous acts of intoxicated destruction, he helped set it on fire. If you only look at the flames, you miss the tragedy. To understand what was really lost that night, you have to begin long before the torches, long before Alexander, long before the smoke climbed into the dark over the plain of Mavdasht. You have to begin with a ruler who already had everything power was supposed to want, and still believed it was not enough. Darius I did not inherit a simple kingdom. He seized, stabilized, and expanded one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. His authority stretched from the Indus to the Mediterranean, from Central Asia toward Egypt. Tens of millions of people, 23 satrapies, vast languages, customs, climates, and gods, all made to stand inside one imperial order. He already had capitals for the practical needs of rule: Susa for winter, Ecbatana for summer, Babylon for administration and imperial gravity. Any ordinary ruler might have looked at that arrangement and called it complete. Darius did not, because governing an empire is not the same as persuading an empire to imagine itself as one thing. That was the deeper problem. An empire this large could be taxed by force, marched by force, disciplined by force. But force alone cannot create a shared story. Force can extract silver. It cannot by itself create reverence. Force can make provinces obey. It cannot make distant peoples feel seen inside the architecture of power. Darius understood that. So sometime around 518 BC, he began building something different at the foot of the Mountain of Mercy in what is now Fars province. Not simply another capital, not a city of crowded streets and everyday administration, not a fortress crouched against invasion. Parsa was conceived as something stranger and, in some ways, more ambitious. A ceremonial center, a deliberate theater of empire. Its platform rose above the plain, like a statement already translated into stone. Vast retaining walls, precisely cut limestone, an elevated space that did not exist naturally and therefore announced, from the beginning, that this place was meant to be more than practical. It was an artificial world built above the ordinary one. You were supposed to feel that as you approached it. The climb itself was part of the lesson. Power was not hidden there. It was staged. But what may be most extraordinary about Parsa is not the scale. It is the paper trail. When archaeologists excavated the site in the 20th century, they discovered thousands of clay tablets in Elamite script. And these tablets did not tell the old flattering story conquerors and romantics often want from ancient monument. They were not endless hymns to kings. They were payroll records, administrative accounts, lists of workers, rations, occupations, deliveries, and compensations. They revealed stonemasons, brick molders, decorators, sculptors, women laborers, mothers receiving additional support after childbirth, They pointed to a project built not on mass anonymous slavery, but on paid, documented labor from many parts of the empire. That changes the emotional texture of the whole place. Suddenly, Parsa is not just a king's fantasy in stone. It is the result of thousands of named lives. Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Ionians, Egyptians, and others whose hands shaped the empire's ceremonial heart. Cedar came from Lebanon, precious materials from farther east and west. Craft traditions met each other here not by accident, but by design. The empire did not merely collect tribute, it collected skill. Imagine one of those workers, not a king, not a general, not a famous name preserved in Greek histories, but a tablet keeper in the service quarters below the grander halls. A man who knows the empire, not as abstract geography, but as shipments, measures, tallies, and voices. He sees caravans arrive from lands he will never visit. He hears accents he cannot imitate. He records payments in grain and wine. He notices which sculptors carve folds of cloth differently, which masons prefer which tools, which women come back to work after receiving extra rations during childbirth. For him, empire is not a map, it is a rhythm of arrivals. And above that rhythm, day by day, Parsa rises. Darius lays the vision, Xerxes expands it. Later, rulers continue it. The gate of all nations announces itself with massive guardian figures and inscriptions in multiple languages, because everyone who enters is meant to understand that this place belongs to an imperial order vast enough to speak in several tongues at once. Beyond it stretches the Apadana, the great audience hall, its forest of columns lifting cedar beams high overhead, its surfaces once painted and gleaming, its reliefs not simply decorative but didactic. Delegations from the empire ascend the staircases bearing tribute, each rendered with distinct clothing, posture, gifts, and dignity. Not a faceless mass, not a single flattened people, a procession of difference carefully arranged into harmony. That is the key. Parsa was not trying to erase diversity, it was trying to choreograph it. That is a much more sophisticated project. In many empires, difference is tolerated, in some, crushed. In Parsa, difference was displayed, framed, ritualized. The imperial message was not, "You are all the same." It was, "You are all different, and yet all of you fit here beneath the same kingship." This is where the city becomes emotionally dangerous, because now it is no longer just beautiful, it is persuasive. Every spring, on the equinox, that persuasion became visible. Nowruz, the Persian New Year, arrived not only as a festival of seasonal renewal but as a cosmic and political affirmation. Day and night balanced, light over darkness, order over chaos. In a Zoroastrian-inflected, imperial imagination, this was no small calendar event. It was a fitting moment for the empire to reenact its own legitimacy. Picture the morning. The mountain catches the first light. The plain is still cool. Delegations have traveled for weeks. Armenians with silver vessels, Babylonians with textiles, Indians with precious goods, Ethiopians with rare animals unfamiliar enough to stop conversations in mid-sentence. The smell of incense, roasted meat, dust, leather, sweat, and spring wind mingles in the air. The staircase rises ahead, broad enough, not merely for movement, but for dignity. You are not rushed upward. You ascend as part of an image. This is where the city becomes more than architecture. A man from a distant satrapy climbs those steps and sees himself already anticipated in stone. His clothes, his tribute, his people's presence have been carved into the empire before he even arrives. He is not equal to the King of Kings, of course. No one mistakes the hierarchy. But he is not invisible either, and that matters. People will endure hierarchy longer than humiliation. They will offer loyalty more readily to a power that has made room to acknowledge them in public ritual. That is what Darius built. Not kindness, not modern equality, nothing anachronistic like that, but something politically brilliant, an imperial grammar of respect. The feast matters too. Greek writers later marveled at Persian luxury, but luxury at Parsa was not only excess, it was language, banquets, gifts in return, measured abundance, carefully staged generosity. These were ways of saying that the empire took and also gave, demanded and also recognized. Even the records of workers receiving extra rations tell us something about the mentality of the place. Parsa was not merely built to impress the world. It was built to convince the world that Persian order had room for reciprocity, and that is why Alexander's arrival there becomes so charged. By the time he reaches Parsa in 330 BC, he has already done what once seemed nearly impossible. He has crossed into Persian territory, beaten Achaemenid armies, and shattered the political backbone of the empire through relentless victories. Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, Darius III in flight, Babylon taken, Susa taken. The young Macedonian king now stands not merely as an invader, but as the man who has overthrown the greatest empire on earth. And yet, victory creates a new problem. A conqueror can destroy an empire and still fail at inheriting it. This is Alexander's true crisis at Parsa. Because defeating Persia was one thing, becoming the legitimate center of the Persian world was another. He could march into Babylon in triumph, seize treasure, and command the fear of soldiers. But could he command the meaning of what he had taken? Could he step into the role of King of Kings in more than title? Could he understand that an empire held together for generations by ceremony, reciprocity, and stage dignity required more than battlefield genius? Parsa was the test, and the city, in a way, offered him an answer. Its gates were opened, its treasury exposed. No dramatic battle was needed there. The city surrendered. Alexander entered the ceremonial heart of the empire he had broken. He also encountered horrors on the road: mutilated Greek artisans, allegedly kept for their skills, and disabled to prevent escape, a discovery that may have sharpened his rage and fed older Greek memories of Persian cruelty and arrogance. Revenge was now easier to justify emotionally, even if politics demanded something more careful. For months, Alexander's men occupied Parsa. They looted the treasury on an almost unimaginable scale, extracting wealth that ancient writers described as one of the greatest accumulations ever gathered in one place. Mules, camels, endless labor, just to move the treasure. The symbolic center of Persian splendor was becoming a warehouse emptied into the future of Macedonian ambition. But the treasure was not the main question. The real question was what Alexander would do with the city itself. And here the path forks. If he spared Parsa, preserved it, and used it, he would be announcing something profound, that he intended not merely to punish Persia, but to inherit it. He would be telling the empire's former subjects that the stage still stood, that the rituals of recognition would continue under new rule, that conquest had ended and succession had begun. If he destroyed it, he would be saying something else, that the Persian imperial heart deserved annihilation, that memory was to be answered not with incorporation but with fire, that Greek vengeance still outranked imperial continuity. One choice would make him larger than a conqueror, the other would keep him trapped inside conquest. This is why the famous feast matters so much. The story survives in varying forms through ancient authors, with differences in tone and motive, but the broad outline is unmistakable. There was drinking, celebration, victory, music, emotion. At some point, Thais, an Athenian woman associated with Ptolemy's circle, rose and urged that it would be a glorious act to burn the palace of the Persian kings in revenge for the burning of Greek temples, especially Athens, by Xerxes generations earlier. Alexander agreed, and what followed was not a sober administrative decision. It was spectacle, intoxication, performance, and politics collapsing into one moment. But we make a mistake when we treat Thais as the whole cause. She was the spark, not the fuel. The fuel had been building for years. Greek memory of Persian invasion, Alexander's need to satisfy Macedonian and Greek expectations, the intoxicating logic of total victory, his own uncertainty over whether he was avenger or successor, the emotional volatility of a young conqueror, standing inside the most symbolically loaded city he had ever taken. That is the deeper drama, not a drunken accident alone, and not cold policy alone, a failure of identity. Alexander had reached the exact point where he needed to decide what kind of ruler he would become. And in that moment, he chose the language of revenge over the language of inheritance. The procession that followed was grotesquely appropriate. Torches, music, revelry, movement through spaces built for another kind of ceremony. Once, the processions of Parsa had carried tribute, textiles, silver, and the disciplined dignity of imperial order. Now a different procession moved through the same world, a victory dance fueled by wine, memory, theater, and wounded pride. And then the torch touched cedar. That detail matters more than it first seems. The cedar had come long ago from Lebanon, lifted into roofs and beams by workers whose labor outlasted the kings who commissioned them. It had stood above diplomatic ritual, seasonal renewal, gift exchange, and royal display. Dry wood remembers flame very well. Once the fire took hold, it ran the way destruction always runs when civilization has spent generations making beauty flammable. Beam to beam, hall to hall, symbol to symbol, the palace of Xerxes burned. The Apadana court. The halls darkened under smoke and then roared into brightness. Treasure rooms already stripped collapsed into ruin. Stone itself, which seems eternal from a distance, began to betray its own vulnerability under intense heat, cracking, spalling, scarring. The physical heart of Persian ceremonial kingship was turned into a furnace by the very man who might have used it to become more than a destroyer. Imagine, again, the tablet keeper, or a carver, or an attendant from a provincial delegation who had once stood in awe beneath those columns. What would such a person feel watching the fire? Not merely grief at the loss of a building, not even only fear of the new ruler, something more specific and more devastating. The realization that the man now claiming dominion over Persia did not fully understand the thing he had won. Because Parsa was not just where Persian kings displayed wealth, it was where they transformed wealth into legitimacy. Gold can be stored anywhere, ceremony cannot. A treasury can be moved. A political language embodied in architecture, ritual, and expectation is harder to rebuild. This is what Alexander destroyed. Yes, he burned wood and painted surfaces and royal rooms. Yes, he scarred the platform that had taken generations to complete. Yes, the fire left ash so deep that archaeologists many centuries later would still find the evidence in the ground. But the larger loss was subtler. He severed himself from the one stage that could have welcomed him into Persian kingship without words. And history, in its bitter way, seems to have noticed. Alexander would go on. He would continue east. He would adopt elements of Persian kingship. He would experiment with fusion, ceremony, dress, and court ritual. He would try, in fragments, to become ruler of a blended empire. But the most eloquent place for that transition had already been damaged by his own hand. He tried later to inhabit an imperial role he had, in one drunkenly lucid night, symbolically wounded. Some ancient authors say he regretted the burning. Perhaps immediately, perhaps later. The exact timing matters less than the fact that regret clings so naturally to the story. Of course it does. Even conquerors can feel the difference between destroying resistance and destroying meaning. And what a meaning it was. Parsa had stood for 2 centuries as the annual answer to a difficult imperial question. How do you make 23 nations come to the center, not only because they must, but because the center has been designed to frame their presence? Not equality, not liberty, not modern ideals, something older, sterner, and still surprisingly sophisticated, mutual visibility inside hierarchy. That idea proved harder to kill than the palace itself. This is where the story turns away from mere ruin and toward legacy. Because Alexander's empire, for all its velocity and brilliance, fragmented almost immediately after his death. His generals carved it apart. His conquests remained astonishing, but the unity of what he won did not endure in the form he imagined. Parsa, by contrast, even in ruin, continued to speak. Its reliefs remained, its columns, or some of them, remained. Its blackened stones remained. The memory of Nauruz remained. The logic behind its ceremonial center remained in cultural time longer than the empire of the man who burned it. That may be the final irony. Alexander won the land, but not the lesson. Parsa lost its roofs, halls, and festival splendor, yet preserved the deeper argument it had always embodied, that endurance comes not only from fear, nor from wealth, nor from the charisma of one extraordinary man, but from the ability to give many peoples a place inside a larger order. You can loot treasure in a season. You can burn a palace in a night. You can crack columns, melt precious objects, and stain stone black. What you cannot do so easily is erase the idea that made a monument necessary in the first place. That is why the ruins still move us. Not because they are merely picturesque remains of a vanished glory, but because they allow us to stand before the scar and understand what the scar means. It means an empire once tried to solve diversity not only with the sword, but with ritual. It means a conqueror once stood at the threshold of true inheritance and chose spectacle instead. It means that some of the most important losses in history are not military, but interpretive. Someone wins the world and still misunderstands what he has taken. If you walk Parsa in imagination on the morning before the fire, it is a city of ascent, delegations climbing, columns rising, gift and counter-gift, light widening over stone, a civilization telling itself, with immense confidence, that order can be beautiful. If you walk it again by night after the feast, it becomes something else. A city of descent. Fire dropping through cedar beams, meaning giving way to noise. Victory turning theatrical because it is not yet secure enough to be wise. And somewhere between those two images lies the whole tragedy of empire. Darius built Parsa because he knew rule needed more than power. Alexander burned it because, for one fatal night, power felt like enough. It wasn't. The flames won quickly. Fire always does. But history is slower than fire. History kept the names of Darius and Xerxes attached to one of the most extraordinary ceremonial landscapes of the ancient world. History preserved the payroll tablets that revealed human labor and administrative care beneath imperial grandeur. History left the reliefs of many nations climbing toward the same center. History let the scars remain visible so that later generations could read both the achievement and the wound. And history quietly delivered its verdict on the young conqueror who torched the very stage that might have taught him how to rule what he had conquered. Parsa was never just the city that burned. It was the city that revealed the limit of conquest, because there is something harder than defeating an empire, understanding why it lasted. And on the night, Alexander helped set Persepolis on fire. That was the one victory he still had not earned.